Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome back to the carpet, because we haven't got a stage, Ben Duncan. Fantastic first half, Ben.
Thank you very much. Cheers. I'm going to start with 3-4-4 marches, just to get the pipes settled again. The first march is Hornpipes Castle. The second is the Flet from Flotter. Everybody knows it. I think you're born with it. It's one of these tunes you're just born with. And the last tune is Mr. Condo's Farewell to the Global Arena, which is a tune I composed. We do a Japan trip every year with the school band. Very fortunate enough to go out and play at a youth world rugby tournament in Fukuoka. And there's this place called the Global Arena. But anyway, long story short, the guy that owns it, or the guy that managed it, he was always very good to us. He was leaving, so he got his tune. So that's Mr. Condo's Farewell to the Global Arena. All going well, I'll then go into a march to Spain Reel. The march will be the Duchess of Edinburgh, good Edinburgh tune, followed by an interesting setting by the Canadian John Wilson called Thoughts O' Burns. Now the Strathspeys, it's got hints of Green Grow the Rashes all going through it. You can hear wee snippets of it as it goes. It's quite an interesting thing. And finishing off with G.S. McLennan's The Little Cascade. So the next set I'm going to play begins with a tune called the Island Lullaby, which actually sounds, going back to Pibroch song and Pibroch and all that stuff, there's hints of it running through the very famous tune "My Crimin Will Never Return," which we maybe get to, we'll see how many sets we get through tonight, but the tune's certainly got hints of that melody going through it. A beautiful little slow in the John McLeod collection. There you go. He's the man of the evening, so he is. And then to top it off, we'll then go into the really catchy tune, Donald McLennan's tuning phrase, which I believe is based on the man's actual you'll hear that going through the tune. Followed by a tune called Calliope House, and then into the little cascade in Jig Time. We'll see how that goes. Let's go. Thank you very much. Cheers. I've had a couple of requests to talk about my pipes and bits and bobs, so tonight I'm playing a set of the David Glenn's made by Kintail bagpipes. So in the past couple of years he's got the rights and he's got the tooling to make David Glenn's, J&R Glenn's, and he makes the older Kintail style as well. So I think it's a pretty fabulous instrument, pretty good. I played a Sinclair Chanter from 2014, Chesney Reed, and Bruce Hitchens's high resonant yellow reeds. So that's one thing. Grant. I'll just pull things back again a wee bit with a very, very common Pibroch actually. Not the whole thing, don't worry. But a tune called Too Long in This Condition. Which a lot will be familiar with, but in the Donald MacDonald setting. So it's a really, the first variation in Dublin is a beautiful little thing. So, and you'll notice about the Donald MacDonald style has lots of these run-down piano style cadences at the beginning of the lines and whatnot. So the story behind Too Long in This Condition, Peter McCrimmon, I believe, was captured after the Battle of Sheriff's Muir and was stripped of his clothes, and he'd had a bit of a rough time, hence the title Too Long in This Condition. Or that's my understanding of it anyway. So this is a Donald MacDonald setting of, or the first couple of variations of Too Long in This Condition. thanks very much, cheers. So hopefully that sheds a wee bit more light on another verse in the tune, which I think is very, very nice actually. The way Donald McDonald does it is every couple of variations goes back to the ground, and then goes down the tune again, and back to the ground again, and then back to the variations and back to the ground. So the whole thing takes a wee while. But it's a beautiful tune, lovely. Cool. I'll now move on with a couple of quirky marches. So the first one being a tune by William Sinclair called The Queen's Edinburgh Rifles. Quite an interesting little thing. Followed by another composition, Pipe Major Robert Rennie, which again has got a quirky ending phrase. So this is The Queen's Edinburgh Rifles and Pipe Major Robert Rennie. you'll know what I mean by quirky. Very quirky. Very quirky. Okay, I think I'll move on with a set of Strathspeys and reels, or a Strathspey, and some reels. The first Strathspey is the Bob Fetter cairn. The 6 parts of the Bob Fetter cairn. The last 2 parts aren't often heard, but are floating about in the David Glenn book. Followed by a Gaelic tune, Hug Era Vonnie Vor, which is something like it's something like, what is it? It's like Salute to the Big Bonnet or something like that. There you go. My Gaelic's not very good from Edinburgh. Into then the Bob Fetter cairn in real time, and then it wouldn't be a recital without some Gordon Duncan stuff. So I'll then go into Davy Webster's reel, Pressed for Time and Contradiction. we'll now move on with a couple of hornpipes and a couple of jigs. The first hornpipe is a tune by Roddy MacDonald, Iris MacDonald, called The Gaelic College St Anne's, followed by a tune composed by myself called Dougal, which is named after a 4-year-old Sprocker Spaniel. Followed by another tune by myself called The Media Shirt. Now, so Matt Wilson, so I'm in the Field Marshal Montgomery Pipe Band, and Matt Wilson, who's now the pipe major, was the pipe sergeant last year. Every single time that there was a camera, a video camera, he would appear with his blue denim shirt on. So that shirt then became known as the media shirt. So anytime he's getting an interview, he had this blue denim shirt on. So that's the media shirt. And then finishing with a Roddy MacDonald jig, the Last Tango in Harris. So it's a Roddy MacDonald sandwich, if you like. to prove that it's live music. Smash it, right. What else have we got? I think we'll have another wee snippet off a bit of Pibroch song and a bit of Pibroch. So as I was talking about before, there's a very famous Pibroch. It used to be very popular, printed in lots and lots of collections, but probably not played so much nowadays, called Recital, McCrimmon Will Never Return, which was composed by, let me get it right in front, Donald Bannister, of course, who had foresawn his own death, apparently, at the rout of Moy. And he was right. So what he done is he wrote this tune, McCrimmon Will Never Return, about himself, and then he went off to the rout of Moy, and there was only one shot fired at the rout of Moy, and it was by a blacksmith, and it hit Donald Bann, and he was the only man killed. So he wasn't wrong. So anyway, that's Donald Bann McCrimmon, and I've paired it with so there's a tune, McCrimmon's Lament, which is, it's definitely taken from that. I think in this case it's probably taken from the Pibroch rather than the other way about, but it gives you a good feel of what it's all about. So, McCrimmon Will Never Return. Right, thank you very much. You've been a pleasure to play to tonight, so thanks for listening. I'm going to finish up now with a set of step dance, Strathspeys and reels. So I had to go up and play. I didn't have to. I went up to play at the Racing Invitational contest that Hamish Moore was running last year. So you basically had to play a bit of piobaireachd song, similar to what you've heard tonight. A set of jigs to dance to, and a set of Strathspeys and reels. But they all came with stipulated tempos, and the tempos are mental. So I'm going to start off. I'll tell you the names of the tunes. So the whole thing was sponsored by Racing Whiskey, and it was held in Racing. So I've tried my hardest to make the set as whiskey related as possible, or as Racing related as possible. So I went through some old collections, the William Gunn collection, the David Glenn's books, various other things to get these tunes. So the first one is called Black Duncans. I'm a Duncan, there we go. Craig Boddick, which is a Don McLeod tune, of course it is. Played slightly different, a tune called Highland Whiskey, it's the first of the whiskies. Lady Loud in a slightly different way. Charms of Whiskey, Lowland Amusement, a wee nod to a Lowland dram. Mrs MacLeod of Racing has to be, but it is an older setting of it. Macpherson's Reel, Scotch Mary, that's the best I could do, and I finish off with Johnny MacDonald's Reel. So, here we go.
I'll never look at that term quirky in a new, different light ever again, but what a stellar performance that was, Ben, and on behalf of us all, I'd like to thank you for entertaining us for this evening. Absolutely terrific. We're in awe of you. And we wish you every success in your new role as a pipe sergeant for Field Marshal Montgomery. We'll be keeping an eye on what you're doing, and whatever you do in your career, I'm sure it will be a stellar career for you. And that last set was to do with whiskey. You've probably travelled all over Great Britain and all over the world and tasted various types of whiskey, but probably you haven't tried one from Suffolk, which is an Adnams whiskey.
Don't insult them now.
Thank you very much. And we'd like you to invite you to become an honorary member of the Ipswich Piping Society. And and thank you very much. On behalf of us all, once again, thank you very much.
You.
One thing, those lucky winners of the pipe carrying bag and the chanter, the Kintyre chanter and Deal's pipe bag, if you could come up, and would you mind just having a photograph? Because I want to send it on to RG Hardy and McCallum's for their website. So thank you very much. Before I go, thank you very much for supporting our recital. Hopefully we'll see you again next year. And all I can say, have a safe journey home, whether you're going back tonight or tomorrow. And those staying over, please enjoy yourself tonight. And thank you very much for all your support, and safe journey home. Thank you.